let's go across to India Economic Conclave to hear the address from Mr. Raghuram Rajan.
So Professor Rajan is an insider, having been in a very, very critical position in some of the most important years of the past decade. His contributions have also been there in the last decade, and which has brought us here. He has, written a few very insightful pieces in the last few months, just after the pandemic, and some of them actually motivated or inspired us to look at calling him in and to ask him a few questions to get more explanations on those subjects, because they look very, very relevant to our theme of the great Indian democratic dividend. So I'll straight get to the questions. We have half an hour. Dr. Rajan, Professor Rajan, at the beginning of 1990s, most parameters were at par for China and India. India's most forward-looking administration till date at that time kick-started liberalization, even as Deng Xiaoping put China on its new path. While the Chinese leadership got an uninterrupted run that led to where they have now reached, P.V. Narasimha Rao failed to get the next term. We saw this again in 2004 when India Shining failed to return the Vajpayee government to office. Is democracy a luxury that large lower-income countries cannot afford? How can we compete and survive when the voters themselves are bottlenecks to infrastructure and productivity?
Well, first, thanks for having me here. Second, we were at that time maybe 10 years behind China in terms of reforms. China started really late 70s, and we started in a big way early 90s. So there was about a 10, 12-year gap. So that's number one. Two, I think the changes in government in the early years were not a complete abandonment of reforms. If you think of the dream budget that Mr. Chidambaram presented, that was in one of the coalition governments that succeeded Narasimha Rao. And similarly, even though the NDA didn't get its term renewed, we saw that for the first few years of the UPA regime, there was a substantial amount of progress. Growth was strong until the global financial crisis. So it's not as if every new government sort of throws away the reforms that previous governments enacted. There might be a rebalancing. So, for example, the UPA focused much more on redistribution, while the NDA, the first NDA, focused much more on growth. And I think that combination sort of helped and perhaps was necessary democratically speaking. So I would say that the jury is still out on whether that combination of strong growth, focus on redistribution, in some ways was as good, if not better, than what the Chinese did. The Chinese focused primarily on growth, and over time that paid huge dividends, but we tried to take a slightly different path.
Thank you. Although, they have been able to take a lot more people out of poverty than we have been able to. Of course, now we have almost caught up there. Coming back to reforms, you spoke about the timidity of reforms and lack of democratic dialogue in formulating policy in the recent years. Is protest in today's political environment really constructive when groups pick issues not for the merits, but the expediency of putting the other side of balance? All parties, including the one in power, behave the same way while in opposition. Your take on the subject, sir?
Look, democracy is not always easy, right? It requires navigation, and clearly that requires a certain amount of dialogue. You hope that in that dialogue you get some course correction, you get some of the edges taken off policy, but that makes the policy more appealing to a larger number of people. Let's face it, we are in a democracy, we can't wish it away. At the same time, it has a lot of benefits. I mean, if you think about some of the poster children of autocracy today, Russia and China, you can see the consequences of having no checks and balances. Russia's got into a war that many Russians don't agree with, and which is going to set their country back significantly. China, seemed to be successful with its COVID policies, but now it's got stuck because the COVID policies are so clearly associated with President Xi Jinping that they have no ability to back off. Think also about our sort of jhatka decisions that were made, demonetization, or the lack of attention to vaccines. I mean, these are all areas where perhaps a little more transparency, a little more dialogue might actually have led to better decisions. Demonetization, you can't have a public dialogue about it, but at least within government, perhaps a little more checks and balances might have prevented us from taking that step, which led to large setbacks to the economy. So broadly speaking, I think it's hard to argue that authoritarian decisions taken by a small coterie are necessarily beneficial for the country, and our past suggests they're not. Democracy is good. Is it always good? No. It does slow things down, but that's the price you pay for making better decisions.
So reforms by any route, as we discussed, is after all reforms. I'm sure you agree that the farm loss and dismantling of MSP would have eventually improved the productivity of our agriculture sector, which is very, very essential. In spite of that, critical state elections may have played a role in the rollback, which we saw. So would you consider this a positive step as it signals that there is respect for the voter?
Look, I think that in the farm laws, there were some good elements, and I've said that repeatedly, but also it was a centralized one-size-fits-all kind of law. And obviously, it impacted different states in different ways. Experts in the agricultural area tell me that it could have been much better tailored, especially if large elements of it had been decentralized to the states to figure out what worked best for them. That said, the MSPs are also something that a lot of farmers have grown to, rely upon. And so you can't threaten to take it away without some adequate substitute. What was important was a dialogue and shaping what that substitute would look like. When you talk to farmers, they're obviously very concerned about, for example, growing rice in Punjab, which is a water scarce state. But how do you move from that? That's where the dialogue comes in. And so my sense is that this should not be a signal to abandon reform, but to start talking about how you would implement it in a way that first takes into account the interests of different parties, but then is much more clever about how to, in a sense, formulate it such that it has broader appeal. I'm not saying it's always easy. In fact, it's very difficult. But that's the challenge of governance in a vibrant, raucous democracy like ours.
You've been critical of India's China-like manufacturing push. Not critical, I wouldn't say that you were totally against it. Can you explain what are your arguments about the flaws in pursuing manufacturing mainly, and why do you think it won't work for us? You also spoke about an alternative path, one that focuses on global services market. Can you elaborate on this? How does our democratic system become an advantage in this endeavor? And what should we do?
First, I'm not saying in any way we should abandon manufacturing. There are, lots of places where we are doing reasonably well. In fact, very well when you look at, for example, the two-wheeler industry. We're the biggest two-wheeler industry in the world. But what I'm saying is, let's not put all our eggs in the manufacturing basket. And I would say there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. One, the manufacturing space is obviously hyper-competitive, like many other things in the world, but it's also where authoritarian governments have a lot more capacity to ram through the decisions that are needed. For instance, one of the ways China grew very fast was by suppressing wages, but also by suppressing the interest that savers got on deposits, so as to create strong negative real interest rates, which then fueled industry with cheap capital. So cheap capital, cheap labor, that was how they grew. And of course, on infrastructure, it's very easy to do infrastructure when you can just take the land and no questions asked, without a protest, without any kinds of problems. And so they've been able to build out fantastic infrastructure. What they build out we have all heard the stories of their high-speed rail network, et cetera, while we're struggling to build that project between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And it is taking us many more years than we calculated initially. So infrastructure, countries like Vietnam, countries like China that don't have as vibrant a democracy have a better sort of chance of building it out. Similarly, I think, they've got there first. And because they got there first, they've also seen the pushback from the industrial world to an expansion in manufacturing. So the problem for us in imitating China's path is China's already created the backlash in the West to manufacturing-led growth. It's not that we will be able to manufacture those cheap assembly line stuff that China manufactured and sent to the US without seeing a similar kind of backlash to India. There's a lot of sensitivity to this kind of stuff today. So what I'm saying is, let's think about what worked for us. What worked for us was first higher skilled manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, but also some of these auto ancillaries and so on. But also what worked for us was services. We've had a tremendous run with software services. So given that the pandemic has now opened up the possibility for cross-border services in a much bigger way, my niece in Bangalore, spent the entire pandemic not traveling, but working as a consultant across India. Question is, if she could work as a consultant across India, why can't she work as a consultant for Chicago, for New York, etc.? That is the kind of thing we need to explore. Similarly, telemedicine, up 20% in the US during the pandemic. Why can't telemedicine be offered from India? Now, there are barriers. For instance, there's the issue of degrees. Is the Indian medical degree recognized outside? Well, if we need equivalence, what do we need to do? Right now, for example, the national health system in the UK is overloaded. Can we have a dialogue with the UK authorities and say, we'll take some of the overload off with Indian doctors from India. We'll do telemedicine. But for that, what is the kind of certificate they need? Can we start having exams which are available to Indian doctors? Now, of course, even as we start having these negotiations, we also need to negotiate with NHS. Will you pay from the NHS for Indian services, or will you say only UK doctors can get paid? That's the kind of negotiation we have to have if the UK wants to trade with India. Let's talk about selling services to the UK and whether they will, in fact, bring down some of the barriers that exist today. But of course, from the Indian perspective, we also have to up our game. We have seen all these doctors coming back from Ukraine, or students studying to be doctors. Clearly, there's a lot of demand in India for learning to become doctors. We have an undersupply of medical training institutions, but that's an opportunity. We can build much more, and we can elevate somebody who earlier had the prospect of working in a manufacturing line to a much higher value added service, providing service to the world. And given that the developed world is going much more into services, that's where the demand is. Well, let's leapfrog manufacturing if we can. I'm not saying penalize manufacturing. I'm saying don't put all your eggs in the manufacturing basket and say we still have to follow the Chinese path, That Chinese path is much harder because China's already there and has already created the backlash. And instead, there's a path which is open, the services path, which we followed with software services. Who would have thought we'd have become a giant there? Can we do far more than just software? We already have a reputation. You know, in the US, you talk doctors, everybody thinks Indian. Mr. Patel, Dr. Patel, Dr. Shah. Why can't we exploit that reputation for good service and sell to the world? And I'll come to the democratic part in a second.
I think you also spoke about data privacy and rule of law in that context, and that we have an advantage there. Can you please expand on that?
Absolutely. So, you know, when China sells this gadget, so long as it is not an information sensitive gadget, supposing it's a toaster, I really don't care, you know, where it was made once I get it, so long as it works, right? The problem with many services is I really care where it is being produced. If I'm dealing with a doctor, I care that they are protecting my patient records. They don't, you know, go broadcasting it around. They don't sell it to companies who can then exploit my data to, you know, sell me products that I'm, you know, particularly vulnerable to buy. So there are these issues with services which you know involve data privacy, data access, and where, you know, as a authoritarian country, I would be very, very worried if my data were held by that country, and so would my country authorities. You know, what kind of people are buying this service from a China or a Russia? What kind of blackmail could they be subject to? And so, if we are an open, vibrant democracy, we look as if we can be trusted. But if in addition we bring in sort of protections which are consistent with our democracy, consistent with the Supreme Court ruling, I think it was 2017, which protect the privacy of the individual, protects their data, not just from dissemination by the company that gets it, but even by intervention by the government. If we can show that we have the checks and balances that can be trusted, then we become trusted service providers to the world, because we are saying, look, even our government can't get at that data without a court order, and our judicial system is respectable and will not give that court order for frivolous needs. So my sense is we have a chance to build on our democratic values. We have a chance to essentially leapfrog where leapfrog into this new area of services. But our democracy should be seen as an advantage there rather than as a disadvantage, and we should build on it.
So one more point on the perception from the outside, we being a democracy, rule of law, etc. We spoke just now. You also touched upon, in a very minor manner, but it's something that is very high context right now, that India's image of being respectful towards its minorities is important for it being perceived as a desirable trading partner and investment destination. I want to qualify that this actually did not matter to the world in its dealings with China, but nevertheless, in the context of the recent disturbances and the news flow, if you may have seen across different Indian cities, how serious do you see this as a factor? Given that we are emerging as the next big consumption center, can we afford to just wing it?
Well, first, I would dispute the fact that China has been able to get away. The treatment of the Uyghur population, to some extent, the treatment of the Tibetan population, is much more front and center. And when you behave badly towards your minorities, it does send a very, very different picture of you to not just consumers across the world, but also to governments about whether you would be a reliable partner whether they actually want to help you. I mean, think about the image that Ukraine has. Why is so much help going to Ukraine today? A lot of it has to do with the way Zelensky plays out in the democracies of the world as a brave fighter for democracy. And forget the reality of Ukraine before this, right? The corruption, the authoritarianism within Ukraine itself in the past, and so on. But now it is seen as somebody that democracies around the world, not just the West, but places like Japan, Korea, want to associate with. So there is a public perception which is very important. Again, where India starts with an advantage, but it is ours to lose. And this is where, to some extent, I think we have to be very, very careful. As you know, in the UK, for example, Infosys got into a little bit of trouble. Partly that was political, but because it was continuing to do business in Russia, and there was a lot of furor, especially over the chancellor and his wife and so on with Infosys. But these things get picked up, and these things get broadcast widely. And the public perception, there's much more of a sense in the public that we can punish corporations that don't behave the way we want. And so that has to be navigated carefully. If we are seen as a democracy, treating all our citizens respectfully, and a relatively poor country, we become much more sympathetic. I am buying this stuff from this country which is trying to do the right thing, and therefore our markets grow. On the other hand, this is a country which is siding with the authoritarians. This is a country that oppresses its minorities, and you read about this every day in many ways. It's not just the New York Times or the Economist, a whole bunch of people, and then you hear this is a country that is suppressing data on how many deaths happened, just like the other authoritarian countries. It all adds up to an image which we can well do without. We may be angry about how this image takes place, but it's the facts of the world.
I think we're running short of time, but I have two very, very important questions coming from one of your papers that I found very, very interesting. Two points here. You spoke about the evolution of our democratic design and quote two broad reasons that affect the same. You said that the constitution makers credited the executive excessively with good intent, with relatively few checks on its power over citizens. The second point that you said was the constitution recognized the power of decentralization, but stopped at the state level. The result today is an exceedingly centralized administrative system, unable to deliver the goods at a very specific citizen service level for a population of 140 crores. You spoke about the pathetic state of services to the ordinary citizens, quoting specifically the state of our education and healthcare systems. This obviously should not be happening in a democracy, but it's happening. So there is a design problem there. So what do you think can be an innovative solution to mitigate this current structure? Now we have got the constitution. It's going to be, a very, very big task to try and now rewrite that and restructure it. So we'll have to work our way around it. So what is it that can be done to mitigate this centralization, which probably is not working to the real, user of these services in a democracy, which shouldn't be happening? Is there a case for more states, as in breaking down existing states to more states of smaller sizes? Would that help?
Well, first, I think the framers of the Constitution were in a difficult position that they didn't want to impinge on the elected representatives too much, in part because their own position was not that as legitimate. They weren't, they didn't come into the Constituent Assembly through a widespread election, a free and fair election. So in that sense, I think they wanted to be a little careful. The point I think is important, however, is that the Constitution has been flexible and has changed with the needs of the time. And I think importantly in that flexibility, has been the fact that we have strengthened constitutional authorities over time. I mean, remember the Election Commission was a farce before T.N. Session actually gave it teeth. And that made our elections much, much better. And so, one, we should certainly strengthen constitutional authorities, and the undermining of constitutional authorities like the Election Commission, but like the Enforcement Directorate or CBI or other such institutions, tends to essentially erode the democratic principle. We can do all that within the Constitution. The Constitution also, talks about decentralization. Now, think about the state of Uttar Pradesh, which has about 230 million people. I'm probably getting the number a little wrong, but that's about 2/3 the size of the United States. The United States has 50 states, and Uttar Pradesh is one state. And of course, you could take each of our districts. But what happens is the administration it's not like the district collector is like an independent governor of a US state. They're not elected. They don't respond necessarily to the will of the people locally. So my sense is that we could do a lot more on decentralizing functions, funds, and functionaries to the local area. Roll out Panchayati Raj in a more effective way. Now, part of the problem here is not so much the center. Of course, we keep talking about center-state relationships, but a lot of states resist the decentralization from their state capital to the local region, especially when it comes to funds and it comes to functions. A lot is retained at the center. So I think that if we wanted to make a significant change, it would be let's focus on pushing more power to the locality, because that would allow the seat of governance to move closer to the people. The people would have more of an ability to affect it. And the seat of power would also see what is happening locally and take decisions which are much more local-centric.
So that brings me to the last question, and I think the most important question is I thought it to be. You've discussed the individual versus group identities and how that affects the state's relationship with citizens and how we see each other as Indians. Everything from the quality of public services to reservations to our very unity and civilizational future is affected by this individual versus group identity as a unit. In fact, the Constitution, recognized the individual as the primary identity unit and not the village. However, our electoral democracy rewards aspirants to power, candidates who can drum up a simple majority. Now, I can tell you as a media manager whose business success depends upon, creating audiences and getting more and more viewership and becoming the most viewed, that it is much easier to build audience when we talk to groups rather than to individuals. So the group identities such as caste, community, religion, language, etc., play a huge part in being able to create support in a political process in our democracy. Isn't it then naive to expect that power would come to political players who work for individuals when it is much more efficient to placate groups and play to that gallery? Our group identities have only got sharper with population growth and competition for opportunities and resources. The impact of social media has accelerated this. What is the solution to this very, very critical problem? That's my last question.
Well, I think it's a combination of both how our democracy works, but also how our institutions work. I think what we will find is catering to groups is going to become increasingly more difficult because there's a fixed pie. When every caste wants more reservations, when every state wants to reserve for the sons of the soil, what is left? When everything is reserved, effectively nothing is reserved, right? So we're going to come to the limits of group-based policies. And certainly, I think there's a lot of movement. When I say individual, I'm talking about looking at the individual condition and saying, okay, I have an awful school. I need to change that if my children are going to do better in life. And so facilitating the process of changing that. We've already talked about one way that can be done if more is decentralized. So I know who's responsible for my local school. It's not somebody way off in the state capital or in the national capital. It is somebody who sits in the panchayat and who essentially signs off on the school's bills. Can I go and talk to them and say, why is the teacher not showing up at the school, more than once a week? So decentralizing power will allow individuals to express themselves more. They don't have to become a amorphous collective. The individual sort of plight can be listened to more. But it also requires our institutions, judicial system, for example, to recognize individual rights a lot more. It certainly is something they're supposed to do, and protect the rights of the individual to protest, to complain, etc., etc. I think that we will see going forward a lot more groups emerging, which are not so much the old traditional caste or religion based, but a lot more about trying to push forward the problems of the individual to the front and center, and asking for redress there. And I think if we have a certain amount of decentralization, that kind of protest will also increase. Now, this is not, again, about totally abandoning the group-based system, moving towards more individuals. It's just about altering the balance that increasingly individuals find it difficult to make it in this difficult economy, and no amount of reservation down the line is going to help if you haven't been to a good school, if your children haven't had good health care. And so we're going to focus much more on the delivery of public goods. And because the delivery of public goods is on an individual by individual basis, I think there will be no option but for our democracy to cater more to those. And I think we should just lend it a helping hand and recognize this is the sort of noisy process by which democracy develops.
Thank you, Professor Rajan. Thank you for taking the time out at so early in the morning for us. Your thoughts will certainly sort of help us, coalesce and get the whole agenda points that we started off with to sort of put focus on the great Indian democratic dividend. Thank you very much, sir.